Thanks to each of you for joining us. We're so excited to host this event with Dr. Elliot Short today with the Better Evidence Project. Elliot is a talented researcher who has done a tremendous work, and we're very excited to hear the details from him today. A few notes of housekeeping. The first of all is that we are recording this session. We would invite you to stay tuned for us to post this to our social media channels and to share that with your networks. The second is a note about how we'll handle question and answers after our session is over. We would invite you at any time during the presentation to write your question or even write your name into the chat feature in Zoom. And after Elliot gives his remarks, we will go through those questions one by one. To encourage this to have a bit more of a collegial feel, I'll invite you at that time to read your question directly to Elliot so you can engage him directly. I did want to mention that this is our first focused research seminar of the fall semester. We have had other events this fall where we have had short talks by different practitioners, scholars, and policymakers, and we're really happy to have now a focused research presentation. It is part of the mission of the Better Evidence Project to communicate research about preventing and mitigating warfare in many forms. And so our forum today will be a deep dive into the topic of states building. Before I begin, I wanted to welcome those of you who are new to joining a Better Evidence Project event and to give you a brief word of update about our current activities. We launched in February 2020 with a group of 36 different practitioners, scholars, and peace builders.
Great, thank you for calling.
joining at the retreat facility behind me. And they identified two different gaps in the field. The first was a gap around the nuanced evidence and the indicators that really do bring research together in different corners of the field. And the second gap was, are our conversations influenced by the expertise of local peace builders? So since that time, we've really worked to bring the Better Evidence Project off the ground, including in the age of COVID, which, as Elliot and I were just discussing, has some shared advantages, including the event we're hosting today. It brings together people from around the world to really focus on this topic from our various professional perspectives. As I mentioned, we're just delighted to have Dr. Elliot Short here with us today. He is a historian and a researcher based in the United Kingdom. His latest book, Building a Multi-Ethnic Military in Post-Yugoslav Bosnia and Herzegovina, is due for publication next year with Bloomsbury. Since earning his PhD at the University of East Anglia, he has consulted on a wide range of projects, including co-authoring Peace and Conflict since 1991, released in 2020 by Peter Lang, with Milt Laurenstein, who is also able to join us today. The report for the Better Evidence Project that we're discussing today combines his knowledge of international interventions and states building initiatives with fresh data and the latest academic and policy literature to provide a unique insight into the effectiveness of such efforts at preventing conflict relapse in countries recovering from war. We're very excited that Dr. Short will be talking to us about 4 different case studies today: Burundi, Chad, Côte d'Ivoire, and Nepal. And his report demonstrates that although states building can help achieve the goal of preventing conflict recurrence, certain conditions and methods are required for it to be effective. Elliot, the floor is now yours to tell us more about what these conditions are.
Great, thank you. So I'll begin with a few thank yous. First to the Better Evidence Project for hosting this event. Second to you, Kristina, for organizing this and helping with the publication. Finally, of course, to Milt Laurenstein, who's just joined us, because without him, none of this would be happening at all. So thanks, Milt. And yeah, as Kristina said, today I'll be talking to you about international state building initiatives. I'm just gonna share my screen. There's a lot of data I want to convey to you all today. Unfortunately, sorry, excuse me. Is that on now? Yeah. Apologies. So as I was saying, yeah, there's a lot of data in this presentation that I want to get across to you. So there are quite a few slides, but I've tried to condense it down, and we'll get through as much as we can. There are 4 case studies that I'll go through today. As Kristina mentioned, there's Burundi, Chad, Côte d'Ivoire, and Nepal. But first, before we get into the detail, let me frame the problem I'll be talking about today and pose some of the questions that I'll be trying to answer, or that I have tried to answer with this report. So the crux of this research really rests on fragile states, and the prevalence for violence to occur in fragile states, the high possibility of violence to occur in fragile states. So in the book Milton and I worked on together, which I happen to have here, is available. We found that the vast majority of wars that have taken place since the end of the Cold War were interstate conflicts, that is to say, civil wars of some kind. In fact, we found there are only really about 2 that were proper interstate conflicts. And depending on your definition, this exact number might vary a little bit, but that's kind of roughly the idea. And it's interesting to note that right now, the vast majority of wars, in fact, all the wars that are taking place right now are interstate conflicts. So while it's fair to say that not all fragile states experience armed conflict, and not all fragile states are doomed to experience it, all states which are experiencing armed conflict are fragile in its aftermath, and approximately half of those which experience the war fall back into it afterwards. They experience a conflict relapse. So research from the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building suggests that about 1.5 billion people, which is upwards of 20% of the entire global population, live in fragile states. And about 70% of those states have experienced a war since 1989. So all that is to say that fragile states present a pervasive source of armed conflict in the world, and their fragility and the conflict that occurs is very much interlinked. I've got this quote up the top here: fragile states make violence, and violence makes fragile states. That's obviously the development of Charles Tilly's old maxim, but that's the idea. That's the kind of premise of this this project. Excuse me again. Now, in the context of all that happening, state building initiatives are implemented by international organizations, national governments across the world. They're extremely common. In some research I did with Milton last year, I found that almost every country in the world has received state building initiatives, with a few perhaps obvious exceptions in Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. So while there is quite a lot of academic literature kind of discussing the ethical implications of doing state building, of strengthening fragile states, based around the prevalence of this practice, there is surprisingly little that actually digs into the details of what state building actually means, the impact it has on the societies it takes place, and whether or not it's effective. So, you know, whichever side of the ethical argument you lie on, whether you think it's inappropriate or not, for the purposes of this report, it's essentially irrelevant, because state building does occur, and I'm trying to find out how effective it is. And yeah, hopefully this report will go some way in producing the better evidence we need to understand international state building initiatives and their impact, and ultimately assess their effectiveness. Now, before I get into the case studies, we also, I need to run through a few definitions and go through my methodology with you, just to clarify how I came to the figures I'm going to be using and the conclusions I'm giving you. And then we can actually dig into the data a bit. So just to be clear, so definitions, when I'm talking about the state, we'll stick to the classic Max Weber definition: a compulsory political association with continuous organization whose administrative staff successfully upholds a claim to the monopoly of the legitimate use of force. So in more practical terms, I've written a complex web of interdependent institutions and processes, which together provide the coercive, financial, and legal framework by which a given territory and the population within it can be administered by a government. And by institutions, I mean things like the police, the military, the courts, and by processes, I mean things like revenue collection, taxes and customs, or elections, anything like that. So I'm really focusing on the nuts and bolts of the state, the actual mechanics of it. I've read literature which kind of argues that for a state to work effectively, you need an effective civil society to kind of counterbalance it and scrutinize it. And concludes that therefore building a civil society is part of the state building process. I'm not digging into any of that. Very much sticking to the institutions themselves. So in that context, state building, simply the procedure in which these institutions and processes are built, developed, and strengthened, thus increasing the capacity of BEP's administrative staff. So that's what I'm getting at. And obviously we're talking about international state building initiatives. These are state building activities carried out by the international community. And just to clarify, by that, I mean the international organizations and influential national governments, including regional groups such as the African Union and ECOWAS, and regional powers such as India and South Africa, rather than the conglomerate of industrialized democracies sometimes it's associated with the term. So I'm not talking about the international community in like a just talking about the West. I'm talking about whoever's acting in that state, in the recipient state. Hopefully that clears that up. I do dig into all this a bit more in the report, so feel free to look at that. In terms of the methodology, I'll run through this quite quickly. I chose Burundi, Chad, Côte d'Ivoire, and Nepal because they fit the one key criterion of the research was that they had to have experienced the end of a conflict since 2006 and not have relapsed back into conflict since then. And this is because I wanted to specifically look at state building initiatives in the post-conflict period. And I wanted to use the Fragile States Index as a sort of barometer of progress. And the Fragile States Index didn't begin publishing its work until 2006. Interestingly though, this selection of states presents some quite interesting axes for comparative analysis. So Burundi, Chad, and Côte d'Ivoire all emerged from European empires in the 1960s. Nepal was never colonized. I mean, there's a complex history there, but it was never overtly colonized. In terms of the armed conflicts themselves, in Chad and Côte d'Ivoire, you had outright victors after the end of the interstate conflict. So one side overcame the other and took over the country. In Burundi and Nepal, the war was ended by a peace agreement, which was followed by like a transitional power sharing government, etc. So a few differences there in terms of the conflicts themselves. Once again, the international community intervened in Burundi and Côte d'Ivoire. It didn't do so in Nepal, and it didn't really do so in Chad. I mean, we'll get to that later, but so there's a few basically angles to look at these cases and try and draw out some conclusions. So a lot of the data I'm going to be presenting you today is financial information which I've gathered. This is to try and gauge the extent of state building initiatives in each case. And basically there's been two quite major problems with gathering this data. The first one is that not all donors make this information public. There's a bit of an overlap, I'll get to this in a minute, but between development and sort of defense foreign policy. So for example, France hasn't published any figures on state building activities since 2011. It's just not available. So whereas on the other hand, the US, the UK, a few others keep quite detailed and easily accessible records online. On top of that, as many of you probably know, the official development assistance figures that are collected kind of globally do not include any military spending, which includes security sector reform, DDR programs, military integration, kind of anything like that is not included. So basically the ODA figures are irrelevant for this project, and it's not possible to kind of talk about state building as a proportion of ODA or anything like that. Essentially, I have to come up with these state building figures by digging through the financial archives of, you know, whoever it might be, USAID, the UN, etc. As a result of that, the figures I'm kind of giving you in this and in the report, they're based up, they're at least sums is what I've described them as. They're an absolute minimum, and they represent a figure, and I can trace every single dollar that I've given, and I can kind of say it was this much in addition to whatever France was spending, for example. Let me also explain the Fragile States Index quickly. So this has been going since 2005. It's compiled and published by the Fund for Peace. It's based on some of the earlier kind of tools they were developing in the 90s to kind of analyze conflict. But basically, it provides an aggregate scoring of each state, basically ranking, giving each state a rating based on media reportage, quantitative analysis of data sets maintained by multilateral organizations, as well as kind of commissioned research by social scientists to fill in any gaps in the existing data. This is all kind of computed together and comes up with this aggregated score. If that doesn't make sense, it will do shortly. And then the data that the index does collect, it groups into 4 themes: cohesion, economic, political, and social, and cross-cutting. These are further broken down into 12 subcategories. So for example, you can talk about the factionalized elites in terms of cohesion. So to what extent are the elites within the state factionalized? You can talk about uneven economic development within the economic theme. So, excuse me. So for this project, I calibrated the index to focus specifically on the state. I basically took the categories which were discussing directly state institutions and left out the ones which were not. So, you know, I include the cohesion of the security apparatus and the political legitimacy of the state as obvious kind of measurements for the strength and ability of the state. So I give you the figures, how much is spent. I show you what the Fragile States Index records the progress of that state has been, whether it's good or bad or nothing. And then I look at the literature, whatever is available, because these, it turns out, are quite obscure cases, and there's very limited selection available. So I went through everything I could get my hands on. You know, I was digging out my old French and reading some French stuff as well. Academic stuff, policy stuff, and journalism. So that's basically what I've been doing with this report, and this is what it contains. If I move on here to the, this is the overall Fragile States Index scores for the 4 case studies in this report. Now, to be clear, these are the overall figures, so they're not calibrated. We'll get to those bits later. But basically, what we want to be seeing here from left to right is a downward trend. We can see a few little examples of this. For example, with Chad in red. Around here, this is basically what we want to see. If this was sustained, Chad would be a very stable place currently and would continue onwards. Unfortunately, after that initial progress, it's kind of stagnated. Similar story with Burundi. In fact, Burundi has gone up slightly since the war ended. It's now considered more fragile than it was at the end of the conflict. The reasons for which we'll get to later. Côte d'Ivoire, we've seen a fairly consistent, steady downward trend, which is what we want to be seeing. And Nepal, over a much longer period, a kind of similar trend as well. So this, as I said, are the overall results, the overall scores of the Fragile States Index. I'll dig into a little bit more detail about that in the report before getting into the case studies, which I'll do now. So we'll start with Burundi, obviously. Now, I'm not sure how much detail to go into regarding the wars in these, but I'll run over it quite quickly. Forgive me any errors. Burundi emerged from the Belgian Empire in 1962, and then since then it's recorded 7 major coup d'etats, in which 5 resulted in a change of government. The most recent of which was in 1987, as well as 6 episodes of civil war and at least 2 acts of genocide perpetrated by government forces. So this is the kind of context in which the war that's the focus of this study took place. It's unstable, to say the least. In 1993, you had the elections, which were won by the opposition. The incumbent government had been in charge for decades. So this was something of a surprise, but almost straight away, the new president was assassinated by the army, which kind of sparked a conflict between the army and a range of armed groups, which were mostly the militant wings of various political parties. One of these groups was the CND-FDD, which you should be able to see on here. The National Council for the Defense of Democracy, Forces for the Defense of Democracy, which was a relatively minor player to start with. Now, during the conflict, the government was essentially powerless. It was the army fighting these armed groups. After the president was killed, a compromise president was put in place. He was around for 6 months before he also died, was killed in a plane crash in Rwanda, along with the Rwandan president. And then the military installed a sympathetic government with another coup d'etat. So this was the kind of context in which the war was taking place. As the war went on, the CNDD-FDD became more powerful. And in 1998, while many of the other groups came to terms with the government, culminating in the 2000 Arusha Agreement, which kind of settled the conflict between the government and a few of the opposition groups, but more importantly, set the framework for the post-conflict Burundian state. But the CNDD-FDD kept fighting until 2003 and kind of managed to increase its position and become quite powerful. So by the time it entered talks with the government, it was able to get for itself, for example, 40% of officer positions in the army, 35% in the police, and they picked the ministerial positions that they wanted. So they really were in a very dominant position at this point. And you might be able to see where this is going. So they very quickly became the most powerful political force in Burundi following the 2005 elections, which followed a new constitution being approved, and the CNDD-FDD won a resounding victory and became the party of government, while Pierre Nkurunziza became the president. And in 2006, just to round up the war, the last rebel groups made peace with what was now the CNDD-FDD government. So it was obviously over a decade of fighting. 300,000 people died. The state was, destroyed. You had lots of armed groups in the country. So not a great situation to be trying to build a state, that's for sure. So when we talk about state building, I've included this top figure here, $900 million spent on peacekeeping and stability programs. Now these took place during the conflict and then obviously not state building programs, but I've included them because I think they're quite important and they really do kind of lay the groundwork for the state building process. Like a lot of these peacekeeping missions are kind of laying the foundations for state building programs to take place. So you had the African Union mission in Burundi, which cost $134 million. The UN mission in Burundi, which cost $700 million. And whilst all that was going on, the World Bank spent $50 million on an emergency TDR program in this period. So already the figures are getting quite high. But once the war ended, state building really became a priority, and the immediate priority was security sector reform and military integration. And this kicked off as soon as the war finished, with 30 million euros from the Dutch government, and the Dutch led an SSR program, and also gave 10 million euros towards a police reform program. I'm going to dig into these in a bit more detail later. I'm just kind of running through the figures now. In this time, the US military offered training and equipment worth over $32 million, and they also provided police training, which included training like anti-terrorist units within the police, armed units, and so on. In the meantime, the World Bank began running some programs such as strengthening institutional capacity for government effectiveness, which is worth over $100 million, I think, along with technical cooperation agreements with Belgium and France. There was specifically a state building contract worth, I think, 170 million euros from the EU, which, you know, was designed and purposed for state building. You had capacity building programs from the African Union, and the Swedish and UK governments were also running programs. So you had a lot of people becoming involved in Burundi after the war. I've highlighted a few of the key donors there on the slide. Yeah, and like I said, SSR was the main focus, but it does span across everything: civil service, resource management, supporting the elections, strengthening the courts, and so on. So, what impact did this have in Burundi? Well, as you can see here, it didn't go very well. What we want to be seeing, like in the earlier slide, is a downward trend, and this is completely stagnant. In fact, on every level, it increases slightly. So each kind of facet of the Burundian state became slightly more fragile between 2006 and 2019. Now, why did this happen? A few short answers are, you know, the military, they've attempted multiple coups in this time, while other parts of the military, specifically the intelligence services, being used to repress the opposition, and widespread corruption throughout the military. For example, the funds the Burundian armed forces got for participating in Somalia, you know, the reimbursements they received were supposedly taken by the CND FTD to buy some private jets. So this kind of thing wasn't helping. Alongside that, the constitution and elections were undermined. You might remember earlier this year, Nkurunziza, before he died, was trying to run for his 4th term as president. So this is, you know, some of the initial explanations for why state building just wasn't working in Burundi. So on top of these kind of uninspiring developments, in 2019, Burundi remained 159th on the Legatum Prosperity Index, having been 160th in 2009. So again, no real progress, stagnation really. And that rating is far below the sub-Saharan average, by the way. Similarly, it is currently 185th out of 189 on the UN's Human Development Index. And last year, 2019, approximately 1.77 million people, or over 10% of the population, needed humanitarian assistance. So I think the picture I'm painting here is that the state building in Burundi has not worked, no matter how you try and measure it, frankly. So if I stop sharing my screen, I think you should be back seeing me. So in the report, I identified 3 areas that explain why this has happened, basically. The top one is the determination of the CNDD, FDD, and President Nkurunziza to consolidate the control over Burundi. I've read reports saying, arguing they learned the language, learn the vocabulary of state building so they can appropriate it. They talk about ownership, national ownership, local ownership. They talk about sovereignty, which is obviously completely fine. But this is taking place in the context of receiving the funds and not using them how they were meant to. They're appointing officials based on loyalty rather than merit in the army, in the judiciary. And they basically have proven able to use their contributions to AMISOM in Somalia and other peacekeeping operations to deflect any criticism of kind of this authoritarian trend. So the money is kept coming in, and as long as they're contributing to peace elsewhere, there hasn't really been any objections. So one frank piece of analysis I found said quite bluntly, international state building provided a mechanism to establish authoritarian government in Burundi. The second key point I highlight are the shortcomings of the Arusha Agreement, which was, if you remember, was signed before the CNDD, FDD kind of joined the peace process. So they essentially disregarded it as soon as they came to power. They saw the election as their mandate, not the peace agreement. So they basically ignored it, and the witnesses, the people who are supposed to be upholding the agreement failed to do so, and allowed this to happen. And finally, I highlight the unsuccessful internationally led SSR programs, which failed to separate the military leadership from the party of government. You basically had CNDD officials in the government and in the military, which isn't a great idea. And also, so the Dutch SSR program, for reasons I cannot fathom, didn't include the intelligence service. So whilst they were trying to sort out the army, professionalize it and so on, the intelligence service was given free rein and the government used it to repress the opposition. Also, the Burundian military was deployed to Somalia in 2007, so a year after the fighting stopped. Lots of money started coming back to Burundi from UN remunerations and so on. So a lot of instability, a lot of things going on. Those are the main issues, and I'm aware of the time flying on, so let's move on to Chad and a few more slides. So Chad emerged from the French Empire in 1960, and within 5 years was experiencing an interstate conflict, a civil war. And some of the reports I read have described Chad as being in permanent conflict since this period. So I've kind of singled out the 2005 to 2010 civil war here, but you could reasonably argue, that this is Chad is in permanent conflict. We had ongoing rebellions and fighting in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And that culminated with the current president, Idris Deby, coming to power in 1990. He led 300 Toyota pickups across the desert from Darfur to N'Djamena, which is the capital. Has seized power and has managed to keep it ever since. Now, in doing so and coming to power this way, there are lots of rivals, and lots of them have been based in Darfur. And basically, this 2005 to 2010 war is between these rebels in Darfur with tacit support from the Sudanese government, trying to oust Idris Deby in Chad. So that's the kind of context in which the Chadian civil war took place. Basically, lots of rebel groups united and attempted to overthrow Deby in 2008, 2007, end of 2007. the EU deployed its first military operation U4 to defend or protect refugees. And this was followed up by the UN, but they weren't really involved in the conflict. It was between Deby and this group of rebels. Deby received a huge amount of support from the French government, who essentially guarded the capital for him. And this basically came to an end in 2010 with an agreement with Sudan and separate agreements with the armed groups who've been facing. So moving on to state building in Chad, it's important to note a few things before we dive into the post-war period. That basically the French maintained a presence in Chad from 1960 onwards. So they've been training armies and so on. So state building has, been present since independence. Another important mention is the 2000 agreement with the World Bank to develop an oil pipeline. Now, at the time, the World Bank stipulated that Chad had to spend 80% of the revenue on poverty reduction and set 10% aside as a stability fund. We'll see how this went shortly. Now, on top of this, after 9/11, Chad became quite an important strategic focus for the US and received a lot of military assistance from the US. So when I'm talking about the post-2010 period in Chad, we've already had an awful lot of kind of state building type programs happening. Regardless, so like in Burundi, the focus was on the security sector straight away. So in terms of state building, you had the US, or International State Building Initiative, you had the US spending almost $60 million on arming the Chadian armed forces after the war. On top of that, as perhaps you could have guessed, the money from the oil pipeline was almost entirely spent on purchasing arms for the Chadian army to consolidate Idris Deby's power after the war and during the war. So this made Chad, which is quite a small country really, the third largest arms importer in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it has the largest armed forces in Francophone Africa. So there you go. And France was also running a massive regional operation based in Chad, which was worth over 600 million euros a year. And this included training for local security forces. This led Chadian troops to go off and serve the UN in Mali, the African Union multinational joint task force, which was a regional thing, and the UN in the Central African Republic. So that was the real focus. So the US in Chad here spent 5 times more on arming the Chadian armed forces than they did on other state building programs. So like that's how much I'm talking about when I say the focus was on security sector reform. But there were, I think, there were French and German efforts to support judicial reform and local governments, and they received some election support and so on. So now let's get to this. So like with Burundi, we can see here that basically almost no progress has been made in strengthening the Chadian state. Very limited. Yeah, I'm not, it's basically the same. There's been no real improvements in any category. Overall, it's not great. And on all of the indexes I mentioned earlier, no real improvement in Chad, unfortunately, for the state, for the population. Now I put this down to 3 key things again. The first being the leadership of President Deby. Now he has a regime which has been called untouchables in some of the literature I've read. They're act with impunity. And basically resources intended for development, including state building initiatives, have been appropriated by the state. And this is basically being ignored by the international community because Chad, like Burundi, has been such a key actor in regional security missions, peace support missions, and so on. but yeah, just to illustrate the extent that this was kind of happening, just 3 years after the pipeline opened, the World Bank funded pipeline, DEBI dismantled the control mechanisms for oil exports and diverted the revenue to purchasing arms, which I mentioned. When the EU came in with U4, they built bases and airports for their own use, and then handed these over to the Chadian state, which then charged the UN incredible amounts of money to use them. On top of that, a kind of integrated security detachment, which had been trained by the EU whilst they'd been in Chad, which was a Chadian institution, was then hired out to the UNDP to provide security in Chad. So these kind of things that are built to try and strengthen the Chadian state are then used to enrich DEBI and his untouchables. So yeah, so the UN paid over $10 million just for these security detachments to go around with them for 5 years. So the second reason I give for the failures in Chad are the deeply flawed SSR and military integration process. This is basically illustrated by the fact that Chad has 4 armed forces. So the Presidential Guard, the Army, the Nomad Guard, and another one I've forgotten right now. But this is almost like a feudal system where they're kind of balancing rivals against each other, and they answer up to DEBI. So it's not very stable. They could easily end up fighting each other at for example, if DEBI is to die at some point. So most of the stuff I've read about these armies, they've become militianized. They've got no real professional military training. They've just kind of done quite a lot of fighting, and they've been sent out to UN operations, for example, in the Central African Republic. And this is not gone. And on top of that, I talk about the regional context, that the fact that Chad is surrounded in pervasive instability, and it's a very unstable environment for building an effective and sustainable state. All of that together has basically made Chad a critical regional power with a huge military and a lot of resources, a lot of power inside regional organizations and so on. But it's essentially a failed state. It performs none of the functions of a state. So that almost raises more questions than answers. Now we are short on time, and I did say I've got a lot to try and get through, so we'll move straight on to Côte d'Ivoire. I won't go through the war too much. Essentially, Côte d'Ivoire became independent from France in 1960 and was relatively prosperous until 2001, when armed conflict broke out. Basically, you had the northern half of the country held by the Forces Nouvelles Côte d'Ivoire, and they held the north. The rebel held north essentially, and the government held south. That was basically the war up until 2011, when, following an election in which the FNCI, the New Forces of Côte d'Ivoire, won an election, and then with the support of the UN and ECOWAS, ousted the former government. So just a little bit on this. During the war, the UN spent 3.75 billion on the peacekeeping operation. This is on, and then an additional 2.2 billion after the war. So 6 billion in total was spent on the United Nations operation in Côte d'Ivoire over quite a long period. Now, the focus in Côte d'Ivoire was on the economy, on getting the economy back up and running. And in fact, in contrast to the other 2 cases so far, Côte d'Ivoire essentially paid for and ran its own SSR process, which had its upsides and downsides. Now, in Côte d'Ivoire, we've seen some modest progress towards stability, but honestly, it's quite stagnant once again. And I think if we can look at recent events in Côte d'Ivoire, there's a lot of tension over the upcoming election, so, and whether Ouattara is going to run for a third term. So we'll see. But anyway, so my explanation for this lackluster kind of progress is down to Ouattara, President Ouattara, who came to power in 2011. Now, he secured extensive assistance to support his efforts to bring stability to Côte d'Ivoire. He got the IMF to cancel a lot of, where he used to work, by the way, cancel a lot of Côte d'Ivoire's debt, and he got a lot of loans from the World Bank very quickly. It was, good, effective at least. Unfortunately, since then, he's kind of been consolidating his power, tweaking the constitution to favor him. So his personal role, like in the other two cases with these kind of guys who attempt to stay in power for too long, is one of the main reasons. Second reason I give is that while the international effort did focus on kickstarting the economy, this basically led to incredibly uneven economic development, which basically just heightened a lot of the regional tensions which had sparked the conflict. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. I do explain it in the report, but I'm not going to do that now. And finally, I also point out that the SSR process in Côte d'Ivoire basically was steered right off track, and the troops of the Force Nouvelle de Côte d'Ivoire, who won the war, basically ran the show, and the guys on the other side were pushed out. Now, I think we've got a couple minutes, so let me just go through Nepal very quickly. So in Nepal, you had the People's War, as the Maoists called it, which was launched in 1996. This ran until 2006. The latter half of the war was kind of where most of the fighting happened. Ended with a peace agreement in 2006, and this peace process was very much a Nepalese affair. I think the UN were kind of maybe hanging around facilitating a few things, but it was very much a Nepalese-led peace process, which is quite good. And the conflict ended with mass protests against the authoritarian rule of the monarchy, and a sort of consensus among Nepalese political parties that they wanted to reinstitute a democracy. So that's the context in which the war ended. Now, to run through this as quickly as possible, Nepal basically received by far the least amount of international state building support out of any of the case studies. But as you can see here, it makes by far the best progress. Now, some of the, this is the kind of trend we want to see. It's perhaps a little shallow, but it's going in the right direction. And none of the facets of the state are kind of lagging behind any of the others. And I explained this by basically saying the SSR or military integration process, which was done by the Nepalese political parties within parliament in meetings facilitated by the UN, which was important. But this process was very successful. The Maoists who wanted to join the army, some of them were made officers, a lot of them were paid off, and the Nepalese army, focused on professionalization, modernization, and was soon back out working on UN peacekeeping operations, which is its main activity, really. I also attribute it to the consensus shared across the Nepalese political arena that building a functioning constitutional democracy was the way forward. Everyone from the Maoists who had been fighting for 10 years to the kind of conservative parties agreed that everyone should put down their weapons and participate in a democratic culture. So that's obviously very helpful. And finally, I'll point out that Nepal is the only place which has actually had a change of government since the war. So in Chad and Côte d'Ivoire, you have the same guys in charge for this whole time. And in Burundi, Nkurunziza died earlier this year. So it's the only place we've had government alternation, and I highlight that perhaps this is something worth looking at more, at least. How are we doing for time, Kristina?
Elliot, I'd love to open up the floor for discussion and questions now. Thank you so much for that. If you could stop sharing your screen, we'll move back to the, here we go. So I do want to share that we're very excited at the Better Evidence Project to publish Elliot's full report. We are posting that to our website's research library. It's available now. I'm going to put the link to that in the chat feature, as well as our Better Evidence Project email. And now I would love to open this up for questions. As I mentioned earlier, you can write either a question or you can write your name into the chat feature, and I'd love to call on you directly so you can pose your question to Elliot. As we wait for those to roll in, Elliot, I'd love to ask you about the conclusions of your report, particularly in keeping with the fact that I know we've gathered together groups representing practice, policy, research, donors. In the conclusion of your report, you had mentioned that there were 3 core takeaways. You went into how important it is to get the SSR, the security sector reform, right. I think you touched on how the international footprint needs to be light but sustained. And then of particular relevance, I think, for the mandate of the Better Evidence Project, you had talked about how we need to get local actors right when we're assessing a situation, making sure that there are avenues for their involvement and that this cannot be underestimated. Could you share more about that finding?
That last one specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, the main point of that conclusion is, I think, you know, this report demonstrates that local actors are perfectly capable. If they want to, they can subvert, you know, a state building initiative, take the money from themselves, still present themselves as powerful politicians, and you know, like, there's no shortage of ability. And in the Nepalese context, it demonstrates that when local actors are given, you know, the power and the mandate to attempt to build a state, for example, it's no easy thing. They're perfectly capable of it. It's not, you know, in Nepal, they, the army, the military integration process that they carried out in Nepal was entirely done by them, and it's the most effective of any in this report. So that's the main point I want to get across, is that, yeah, Nepal received the least amount of international attention, and the local actors had the most significant role of any of the cases in what I looked at, and it was the most successful.
Mm-hmm. So we've just had a question come in from Susan Allen. Susan, would you like to direct your question to Elliot?
Hi, yes, sorry, I had myself on mute, and there we go, video off. But my question is, I guess, related to this one you just discussed. Did you consider that, you know, Nepal had less state building direct, and again, I want to read the full report more carefully and look forward to that. But based on your presentation, I'm interested in, why did Nepal have less state building directed at it? And did the international community have some assessments of less need for state building there, is the question I would pose, or what were the reasons for less international community direction of state building? I guess I'm looking for, are there any alternative explanations? It feels, you know, to credit the local peace builders, awesome. I love local peace builders. And yet I also want to look at, were there other structural differences in Nepal that may have been contributing factors to less state building happening there from the international community's perspective?
Yeah.
Thank you so much
Great
for this
question.
presentation. Really, really engaging. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, I should have squeezed a bit more in, maybe. But yeah, great question. So yeah, I'll start with, so the war in Nepal was fought between a government sort of led by a monarchy and the Maoists, and the Maoists essentially would not accept that much international interference, you know, from imperialists abroad, however they would cast them, particularly India. and the US, who are probably the two most interested parties in Nepal. So there was a lot of reluctance from the Maoists to have too much going on in Nepal. Second to that, I'd probably add a strategic consideration on the part of the international community. You know, Chad and Burundi are relatively near major conflicts. So there's an incentive to build stability in Burundi and then try and export some of that into Somalia, and similarly do the same in Chad, and then try and bring it across into Mali. Now, I don't know if that's worked or whatever, but in Nepal, we've obviously got India or China, and Nepal's not going to tell them what to do or be sending any troops into either of those countries. So those are two main considerations. I think those are like the practical answers for why it was quite a light touch. But I would also probably highlight that the UN mission in Nepal seems to have been exceptionally well led and well organized, and it was a political mission. They seem to know what they were doing and what they were trying to achieve. And that might seem obvious, but that doesn't seem to be the case a lot of the time. So yeah, to answer your question, it would be those 3 points.
Philip, I'd love to welcome you now to ask your question.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah, this is Matthew. I'm a doctoral student at the CØTE School. Thank you, Elliot, for this great presentation.
Thank you.
You highlighted an important correlation that other studies have already mentioned, namely the correlation between violence and state fragility. And this includes all types of violence, whether it is armed insurgency, which happen in the framework of intrastate conflict, or terrorism. But you know what is tricky is that states, including national governments and at the international community level, invest more in reacting to conflict in general and to terrorism than on mitigating and addressing the structural drivers of conflict, especially state fragility. And we can see it through some of the data, financial data that you provided. I think the gap between the investment in addressing, in building states and the investment in promoting stability and peace is much larger than what you showed us, but at least it gives us already an idea. Now, donors are reluctant to spend money to address a problem unless it breaks out, right? And it is very difficult. I work for several donors in West Africa, and I could see how it is very difficult to get a grant for a project unless people see that there is a clear need for that. And to show that, you need to show that there is violence, people are dying, or there is a pressing need for that. So how do you reverse this trend? I don't know, but I'm not sure that research findings and statistics will be enough to convince people to change the way of dealing with fragile states.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks for your input. I agree. I think perhaps the best we can hope for here today is to provide some evidence for someone to make the argument that money and resources need to go to the right places and be spent better. What's Milt said?
So I think we're going to ask now Philip. Philip, you had said that you had a question or a remark.
Thank you. Thanks, Kristina. Philip Visser here. I'm joining the conversation from South Africa. I was a former student at, when it was still the Institute when it was still ICAR. I am primarily, I'm a practitioner, and in terms of the conversation, I worked in Nepal, I worked in South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen. So a few places that have experienced transitions, and mostly they have fallen back into conflict. The one question I want to ask Elliot, and thank you for your presentation, is the time frame. It seems to me in my limited experience, the time frame for state building is often extremely unrealistic. If I think of Nepal, then their struggle for democracy is a 60-year struggle, and yet we expect a transition to happen in less than a decade. And I just don't get that. Almost, and it's often European donors, almost if Europe forget their own lessons of 60, 70 years of state building in Europe itself. And so so my one thought is around the time frame and how does that feature into this notion of state building with very, very short milestones. I can quote South Sudan or Somalia, where I worked. The other one is, it seems that the international community is not taking into consideration the localized power dynamics. And South Sudan is perhaps a good example of how that local power dynamics is in fact exacerbated by the state building project. And very soon we found ourselves back into competing for power while the state building process is supposed to move the country forward and out of the conflict. One can almost say it moves the country into the conflict. And perhaps in Nepal, because I work very closely with the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction, is there was a lot of emphasis on localized peace building. I helped to build the local peace committee infrastructure that was under the peace ministry. So just in terms of how do we underestimate Yemen as well, the local power dynamics, and how we not complement the national state building sufficiently with local peace infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks for your input there. It sounds like you've definitely got some stories. I mean, I don't know if I have the answers to your questions, but I'll share my thoughts at least. In terms of the timeframes, I entirely agree that some of these missions and programs are set for 2 or 3 years, and that if the goal is to build a state, that's impossible. Me trying to measure their progress over a decade, yeah, I appreciate that. You know, developing a democracy takes generations probably, but talking from a state which is not functioning whatsoever during an armed conflict to having something which is at least carrying out some of the basic functions of a state, that's the process I'm trying to chart in this report. It's not going to be perfect. I'm just seeing if it can at least get to the point where the conditions where people aren't fighting each other, and it's at least providing the basic services it needs to. So yeah, I would agree. State building is a long process and it takes a lot longer, and donors should consider the longue durée when thinking about state building. In terms of power dynamics, yeah, I think this is something I talk about in the report. One of the main conclusions that not to underestimate local actors and have a proper understanding of what's happening. It really doesn't seem like that's the norm, or at least historically it wasn't the norm. And the examples I found where, like Nepal, like I argue Nepal is at least, when whichever international officials are taking responsibility for what's happening, when they know what's going on and they're working with the right people, that cooperation can work. And when they don't get it right, they just end up donors can end up handing over loads of money to the wrong people and just building armies, essentially, which is not helpful for anyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. George, you've written a very rich question regarding constitutional reform into the chat. I'd welcome you now to ask this question to Elliot.
Oh, sure. Thank you. And Elliot, thank you for such a deep presentation. So much to dig into there. I'm curious, particularly, I guess it would be in the political cluster of variables, the reality of any of these four countries in moving from their peace agreement to something else. Was constitutional reform an issue, in part just because it would seem to improve the stability of a peace agreement, but also then it leads to more control, often of the civilian over the military, with the military in a couple of cases being the key disturbers of a greater degree of cohesion, democracy, and peace. And then the last layer of that, of course, is, was there external support? Were the external donors very much committed to some constitutionalism, and did that make a difference? And I hope this is a fair question because I don't know the data very well, and I just love your observations on that for any of the countries.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great point. I think so. Yeah, in if I try and run through them, in Burundi, the constitution was approved just after Arusha, right? Or no, after Arusha was implemented. And I believe that, I'm not sure about Burundi, you'll have to dig into it, but I know in Nepal, for example, the constitutional reform process was carried out by a constituent assembly, which was elected from the population, and that basically established the legitimacy of the post-conflict state. So, and that, as far as I know, was a totally local enterprise. Right, coming up with that constitution. So the effectiveness of external support for any of these states for constitutional reform, the short answer would be, I don't think there's any evidence in this report saying that international support for constitutional reform has worked. But admittedly, that wasn't an area I was focusing on too much. It comes up a few times in the report. But you're absolutely right to point out that placing the military's role in society in relation to the state, that seems to be the problem, unfortunately. It's almost that straightforward from a state building perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mill, I think you are next in line. You've asked a question now about the amount of money that was invested into Chad and Burundi. Would you like to address your question directly to Elliot?
Yeah. Hi, Elliot.
Hi, Mel.
I'd first just like to suggest to everybody that's participating that you read the full report, which has a lot of rich and very interesting detail in the report. The question is that over a number of years, an enormous amount of money was spent in state building in Chad and Burundi with no decrease in fragility. The question is, how did that happen? What could have been done by the state builders to avoid that? And what's really more important is, for people involved in state building in the future, how can they avoid pouring money into places and getting no results, at least over a period of 8 or 10 years?
Right. Well, so I think this happened. Billions of dollars were wasted for a few key reasons. I'm just ranking them in my head. I'd say, well, the top one is you have a political movement which has been participating in a war, which has an opportunity to seize power, and then does so, and then consolidates power on itself. So those are the people that you're dealing with. It's not Burundian society as a whole. It's not Chadian society as a whole. It's the people who have risen to the top in a war. So being aware of that, and then perhaps having some checks and balances. I mean, I know the World Bank tried that and it just maybe dismantled them. But if you're going to be handing over so much money, specifically as well for military purposes, and you want to build peace in the region, it seems like I'm pointing out the obvious, but some kind of monitoring system. You know, I know in the two cases you've highlighted, Chad and Burundi, as soon as the war ended and the new governments were established, they both asked the international presence to leave the country. So they asked the UN peacekeepers and monitors, etc., to leave the country. Now, UN offices did remain in those countries, but they weren't missions. In Nepal, they had a UN political mission that stayed for a very long time. This is what I talk about, the light but sustained footprint. So there's some potential to work something out there, whether instead of having a huge militarized peacekeeping operation, you know, you don't need that, but maintaining a focused political mission there to keep an eye on everything that's going on. And when, you know, the police reform that you've sponsored gets blocked and then the police is used to repress the opposition, some kind of response system, so you're not spending your money to help them maintain power. How could it have been avoided? Well, yeah, I think I've answered that. And what should state builders do to be sure their work is effective? I mean, I do make a few recommendations in the report. I think it would be, that's the easiest route to answer these questions. But, you know, I don't think I'm really unearthing any, you know, mysteries here. It really does seem quite straightforward that, you know, make sure you know where your money's going and stop giving it if it's going to buy lots of weapons, essentially, is one of the main lessons. And yeah, keeping an international presence, you know, you don't have to be running the country or, you know, infringing on everyone's sovereignty, but just as, you know, a few well-trained experts can just keep an eye on things and what's going on. And don't try and dictate to people. I think that, you know, if that wasn't obvious already, that doesn't seem to work. That just delegitimizes the whole process. Yeah, thanks, Mel. Nice to hear from you.
So I also appreciate Milt highlighting again the full report, and I can share with the group that I've now actually read the report twice, and both times I've read it, I've had additional details come to mind. And Elliot has done us a great service by writing a very rich executive summary in the beginning, as well as elaborating on some of the main recommendations in the end. So if your time is short, I direct you there. And I do want to thank Elliot. I think he's done the Better Evidence Project 2 great services. The first is this very great report, very rich. And the second is for being such a good sport as we've really peppered you with questions and really interrogated you over the past few minutes. As I'm waiting on a question to come in, I think I'll play devil's advocate for a moment with you, Elliot. And I know that you've based this report primarily on the Fragile States Index. So I was wondering if you could comment on, you must think that it's a reliable indicator, why, what are its limitations? And maybe you could comment on that in a specific way. For example, we have cases that are gathered from around the world, really, 3 in different regions of Africa, and then moving east to Nepal. And so is it possible that one calibrated index is just picking up on certain features in a particular context, in a particular region? So again, to focus your remarks on answering the Fragile States Index and its limitations, or why you feel it's reliable for this type of work.
Well, I think, yeah, the Fragile States Index, it's pretty good because it's already a kind of aggregation of lots of different perspectives on the development of a country. It's not, you know, one arbitrary measure. It's quite a lot, and it's been developed over quite a long time. So I do think it's pretty good. It is not by no means perfect, but you know, if I want to look at state building and strengthening fragile states, then, you know, it seemed a good idea to use the index and see where it went, see how it lines up with realities. And I think if we zoom out a little bit to current affairs, and we can see in the 3 states which the Fragile States Index highlighted as being ongoing unstable, so Burundi, Chad, and Cote d'Ivoire, you know, all of these places are quite unstable right now, to say the least. I've seen reports this year since I wrote this one that people are worried what will happen when Idris Deby dies. There'll probably be another war in Chad. The Burundi survived the election. You know, fingers crossed there for sure. And Cote d'Ivoire, I'm not sure what's currently happening, but there's been protests. People are opposing Ouattara's attempt to run for a 3rd term and amend the constitution. Now, this was the kind of thing which started the previous war. So, you know, yeah. So I think it's a good source. You know, take it with a pinch of salt. But, you know, I think it's given us some pretty good insights.
What type of follow-up research would you like to see in this area if you were writing volume 2 of the report that we're publishing this week?
So I think there's 2 routes you could go down, really. One is to find more cases and just keep, you know, casting this net out. And, you know, the more cases we accumulate, the more you've got room for comparative analysis. You can kind of test whether the Fragile States Index is actually, you know, worth using. I think it is. So that's one route, obviously. The other route would be to tease out specific parts that I've raised as issues here. So some of the questions we've looked at tonight as well, I think would be this morning. I don't know what time it is for you. This evening for me. They could be a good basis. But yeah, I think looking at, unfortunately, this like military side of things is probably worth pursuing, just because that's where most of the money is going, and it seems to be the cause of most of the problems. Yeah, I'd start there with the future research, but I think more cases can, you know, easily be added to the 4 we've got already, and will shed some new light for us.
Mm-hmm. I forgot to mention that you have actually been a great sport in a 3rd way, and that's with the transatlantic time change. So thank you, Elliot.
Sorry,
we are running rather close now to the end of our webinar for today. So I wanted to do a last call for any questions that our audience has burning in their mind, to open that up for discussion now. And if not, I get to sit in the interrogator's seat a bit longer because I have written down several more. But if anyone else would like to ask any final questions, now is your moment. So it looks like I have the go-ahead to stay in the seat. One of the things that I had written down was you had mentioned that the paper highlights many of the problems that can emerge from state building initiatives. So given all of this, given all of these problems that, you know, you've gone into rich detail highlighting, do you still think that this is in fact a useful tool for building peace?
Well, that's a great question. So I think the fact that I was able to highlight quite a few problems with this, you know, it's a 30,000 report. It's not a brief thing, but it's, you know, you could spend a career looking at this. So my point is, in a 30,000 report, I've highlighted a few problems which I think could be easily fixed. So it's an imperfect method, an imperfect tool for building peace, but I think it's can be improved if given the kind of framework to improve. So I think it has potential. I also would question what the alternatives are realistically. In a perfect world, it might not be important, but in the context of, you know, armed conflicts taking place because, you know, in the aftermath of, you know, empires and, you know, various other conflicts and things, it's not like we're starting from zero. We're starting from a kind of fragility that's been inflicted on a lot of places by lots. So, you know, you can either deny all agency and this is a huge ethical question, which I'm not qualified to answer, but I think it could be a lot more effective and a lot better if done by the right people in the right way.
Philip, you had sent a very interesting suggestion for further research to me. I wonder if you could introduce that to the group.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. No, perhaps because I've worked both on the ground during the South African transition and for the UN in other countries, I'm so aware of the link between national, if you want, state building or constitutional processes and local peace building efforts. And I'm wondering whether, it seems to me that often the focus from the international community, maybe because it's a matter of access, is on the national state building processes. And I'm wondering what's the nexus and the dynamics between the national state building processes and local peace building / local governance processes. And it seems to me there needs to be, these are complementary processes, and it needs to put in place together. So far, my experience is when the national state building processes fail, then there's a shift towards civil society and local peace building processes. Nepal may be one of the exceptions, South Africa as well, that we embarked both on a national constitutional or state build process at the same time that we embarked upon building a local peace infrastructure. And so to me, I'm wondering what research are available, and maybe some of the other academic colleagues know. But in my experience, that interdynamic between national and local is a very important part as a peace agreement is being put in place, because the peace agreement is an elite process typically, and you need to consolidate on the ground, both through civil society and through local governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, that's a great point. Yeah, I think that would be a great place to start. I mean, straight away, the Constitutional Assembly, which I mentioned in Nepal. I mean, this is something I've seen in quite a few areas I've looked at. But this is very much like the local, people representing the population of the country, forming an assembly to sort of, they're designing a constitution, but that sort of provides the framework for the state to operate in. So that's like possibly where the nexus is between this local and the national in terms of state building. But yeah, and I think identifying that place correctly would be a benefit to building states more effectively. It's definitely something worth looking at.
Thanks, Elliot.
Well, thank you very much. We are now wrapping up our time together today. And I have to say, as Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project, very few things make me happier than when our conversations continue after our formal events. So to keep this conversation going, you can read Elliot's report. You can write to us at bep@gmu.edu. I'd always invite you to reach out to me directly. My name is Kristina Hook, for those of you I haven't yet met. And I want to give a very hearty thank you to Elliot for both the writing and the public talk that he's given us today. We are really in your debt to move this conversation forward regarding state building, how we can make it better, and how we can ultimately move a bit further down the road in terms of preventing and mitigating warfare. Thank you very much for your time today, to each of you, and especially to Elliot Short.
Thanks, Kristina, and thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll be ending today's event, and we would invite you to join us again on November 19th for the next research presentation. Thank you very much. Bye.